A tissue, pulled from a garbage can on a quiet street in Citrus Heights, California. Nobody watching would have guessed it was about to end one of the longest manhunts in American history. For over 40 years, a man moved through California like a ghost. He broke into more than 100 homes. He raped over 50 people. He murdered at least 13. He wore a mask. He studied his victims for days before he ever stepped inside their homes. And when police got close, he vanished. No trace, no name, just terror and silence. Investigators tried everything: task forces, tip lines, composite sketches shown across the entire state, decades of leads that went nowhere. Then, in 2018, a piece of technology built for something else entirely, a genealogy website designed to help ordinary people find lost relatives, did what 40 years of police work couldn't. It found him. This is the story of the Golden State Killer and the family tree that finally caught him.
Arrest that former police officer who authorities say went on a reign of terror for so many years. The numbers, as I mentioned, are simply staggering. At least 12 murders, 45 rapes.
It started in the small farming town of Visalia. Homes were broken into, ransacked, drawers pulled out, photos rearranged, small items stolen, like someone was studying the people who lived there rather than robbing them. Police called him the Visalia Ransacker. They had no idea he was just getting started. Then he moved north to Sacramento, and the crimes changed. He stopped just watching. He started breaking in while families slept, tying up the men, forcing them onto the floor, stacking dishes on their backs, and warning them not to move, not a sound, or their wives would die. Then he'd rape the women, sometimes for hours, while their husbands lay helpless just feet away. He'd ransack the house afterward, taking wedding rings, photographs, small trophies of what he'd done. They called him the East Area Rapist. He never stayed in one place long enough to get caught. He studied his victims' routines for days, sometimes weeks, before he ever stepped through a window. And when police started closing in on one county, he simply moved to the next. By the end of the 1970s, he'd made his way south, to Santa Barbara, to Ventura, to Orange County. And this time, his victims didn't survive. The rapes became murders. Couples found dead in their own homes. Investigators labeled him the original Night Stalker, with no idea he was the same man terrorizing Sacramento under a different name. 3 names, 3 separate investigations, 3 police departments who didn't know they were hunting the same person. By the time he vanished in 1986, he'd committed over 120 burglaries, more than 50 rapes, at least 13 murders, across 11 counties. One man, an entire state, living in fear of a shadow with no name. He wouldn't have one for another 30 years. June 1976. Sacramento was warm, ordinary, the kind of summer evening nobody remembers until they have to. Phyllis Henneman was 22. Young, carefree, the way you're supposed to be at 22. Home with her sister while their father was out of town, doing nothing more dangerous than being a young woman spending a quiet night in her own house. She had no way of knowing a man had already been watching this neighborhood for days, learning the streets, learning the routines, waiting. That night, he broke in. He blindfolded her, tied her up, held a knife to her, and made sure she understood. One wrong move, and it would be the last one she made. What happened next would stay with her for the rest of her life, not just as a memory, but as something that rewired who she was. The girl who walked into that house that evening, and the woman who walked out of it, were not the same person. She survived. But surviving didn't mean it was over. For over 40 years, Phyllis carried what happened to her mostly in silence. One name among dozens of victims of a man police couldn't identify, couldn't catch, couldn't even prove was the same person committing crimes across the state. She went on with her life, the way survivors do, quietly, privately, without justice, without a name to attach to the fear that never fully left her. She had no idea that decades later, she would be standing in a room, face to face with the man who did this to her. She had no idea DNA technology hadn't even been invented yet, and that one day, A piece of it he left behind would be the thing that finally brought him down. For now, all she had was the silence and the weight. Decades passed, and the man behind the mask became a ghost in the truest sense. Investigators cleared suspect after suspect, men who fit the profile, who lived in the right places, who all turned out to be dead ends. His DNA sat in California's database the entire time, waiting. But DNA only works if you have someone to compare it to, and nobody knew who they were looking for. By the 2000s, the case had gone cold enough that most people had simply stopped looking. Police files gathered dust in evidence rooms. Victims grew older, waiting for a phone call that never came. It seemed like this was simply how the story would end. Unsolved, unresolved, another shadow that got away. Then a true crime writer named Michelle McNamara refused to let it die. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't law enforcement. She was a journalist who became obsessed with one question. How does a man commit over 100 crimes across 11 counties and simply vanish? She spent years digging through old case files, interviewing retired investigators, piecing together a pattern police departments had never fully connected. It was McNamara who gave him the name that would finally stick, the Golden State Killer. But she would never see him caught. On April 21, 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep, the exhausting, all-consuming search having taken a silent toll on her health. She was 46 years old. Her book on the case was only 2/3 finished. She never got the ending she was looking for. 2 years later, someone else would write it for her. In 2017, investigators made a decision that would change cold case work forever. They took DNA collected from one of the Golden State Killer's crime scenes, evidence that had sat useless for decades because it didn't match anyone in law enforcement's criminal databases, and uploaded it somewhere those databases had never touched. A public genealogy website, a site built for ordinary people tracing their family history, finding lost cousins, building out their ancestry. The killer had never been arrested. His DNA wasn't in any police system, but somewhere out there, his relatives had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA, just curious about where their family came from. That was enough. The search didn't return a match to the killer himself. It returned distant cousins, third cousins, people who shared just a sliver of his DNA. From there, investigators did something almost unthinkable in scope. They built out an entire family tree, branch by branch, working backward through generations of marriages, births, and records, narrowing down thousands of possible relatives using age, location, and family history until the branches converged on one name: Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old man living quietly in Citrus Heights, California, barely miles from where some of his earliest crimes had taken place. And here's the detail that made investigators' blood run cold. DeAngelo wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He'd worn a badge himself, a former police officer, trained in exactly how investigations worked, exactly how evidence was processed, exactly how to disappear without leaving a trace. The man police had been hunting for over 40 years had, for a time, been one of them. On April 24, 2018, detectives secretly collected a discarded tissue from DeAngelo's own garbage can. The DNA on it was tested against the crime scene samples. It was a match. The next day, police surrounded his home in Citrus Heights. DeAngelo stepped into his own yard, and in an instant, decades of running ended. Witnesses say he offered no resistance, no struggle, no chase. Just a stunned, elderly man in a t-shirt and cargo shorts, protesting in a high-pitched voice about the most ordinary thing imaginable. I have a roast in the oven. 40 years of terror, ended by a family tree and a piece of trash. For 2 years, DeAngelo sat in jail while prosecutors built a case spanning 6 counties and over 1 million pages of evidence. A trial of that size could have dragged on for another decade, an unbearable wait for victims who had already waited 40 years too long. So in June 2020, DeAngelo made a deal. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, and he admitted, on the record, to over 160 additional crimes he could no longer be charged for. rapes, burglaries, attacks the statute of limitations had long since erased from the courts, but not from his victims' lives. The hearing was so large, it couldn't fit in a courtroom. It was moved to the Sacramento State Ballroom, just to make room for everyone he had hurt. One by one, survivors stood and spoke directly to the man who had haunted their lives for decades. Some were in their 80s and 90s. Some of his victims didn't live to see this day at all. And in that room was Phyllis Henneman. 44 years after a masked man broke into her home, tied her up, and told her she'd never forget him, she stood feet away from Joseph DeAngelo and made sure he heard exactly what he'd done to her. The girl who once carried this alone, in silence, for decades, was no longer silent, and she was no longer alone. In August 2020, the judge handed down the sentence, multiple consecutive life terms, without any possibility of parole. Joseph DeAngelo would die in prison. For the prosecutor who had worked this case for years, one memory stayed with him more than any other. He looked across the room and saw Phyllis, the very first known victim to come forward, all those decades ago. And for the first time since 1976, she was smiling. After 40 years of silence, after decades of not knowing if her attacker was alive, dead, or still out there, Phyllis Henneman finally got what she'd been denied for almost her entire adult life, a sense of closure. Not because the pain disappeared, but because, at last, someone had answered for it. The Golden State Killer case didn't just end with one man behind bars. It changed everything that came after it. That family tree, built from a stranger's curiosity about their own ancestry, became the blueprint. Since 2018, investigative genetic genealogy has helped solve hundreds of cold cases across the country, giving names back to victims who'd waited decades, sometimes generations, for answers. But if you remember one thing from this story, don't let it be his name. Remember Phyllis, a 22-year-old who survived the unthinkable, carried it in silence for 44 years, and lived to see justice finally catch up. This was never his story. It was always hers. If this case moved you, comment "Justice finally catch up" below, and let me know which cold case you want covered next.